is Mark Gunn Media.
Hit it!
Welcome to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. I'm your host, Mark Gunn. The views expressed on this program are those of the host and guests and not necessarily reflective of anyone or any entity associated with this broadcast. This episode brought to you by Before Your First Gig, an audiobook written by Steve Dustcircle and produced by Mark Gunn Media. If you're a beginning musician, this is a primer that you'll definitely want to hear. Tips and strategies for setting yourself up for live performances and paid gigs. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Available now on iTunes, Audible.com, and Amazon. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Produced by Mark Gunn Media. This episode, Black Faces in Blackface, Megyn Kelly and Black Sellouts. As we get closer to the midterm elections, you're seeing the true nature of American racism come to the forefront in ways unseen since the Jim Crow era. Mainstream media continues to report and contribute to the racial divide through its obscene stereotyping of people of color. We've been dealing with this for 399 years so far. In fact, August of 2019 will mark the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being kidnapped and forced onto American soil as slaves. This week, NBC Today host and right-wing dumb Megyn Kelly maintained that there was nothing wrong with whites wearing blackface during Halloween.
What is racist? Because truly, you do get in trouble if you are a white person who puts on blackface for Halloween, or a black person who puts on whiteface for Halloween. Like, back when I was a kid, that was okay as long as you were dressing up as like a character. There was a controversy on The Real Housewives of New York with Luann, as she dressed as Diana Ross. And she made her skin look darker than it really is. And people said that that was racist. And I don't know, I thought, like, who doesn't love Diana Ross? She wants to look like Diana Ross for one day. I don't know how, like, that got racist on Halloween.
She had the nerve to feign ignorance regarding the history of such a racist practice. Now, for the benefit of those who may not have a clue, a history lesson.
I think the problem is, for African Americans, we know the history, and too many white Americans don't know or won't accept it. When the reality is, it is American history, yours and mine. When you look at blackface, white entertainers wore blackface to mimic African Americans, to caricature African Americans. When you look at the minstrel shows, black entertainers were forced to wear blackface because whites did not even want to see the humanity of black people, so therefore they had blackface. But this thing went beyond just that. This is American history, where black people have been assaulted in magazines, television, radio, all of these images that have continued for centuries and then, of course, decades, going up to the 1960s and to some degree in the 70s, and we still see it present day. If we really want to be honest, America was created to be a white nation. The beauty standard was a blonde, blue-eyed white woman. And so black women have had to deal with the critique of their hair, their lips, and their hips, and all of that. And so when you have to deal with that, you're understanding how deep this thing is. It's because media has been the main driver of these racist caricatures throughout American history.
The history of blackface is the caricature of African Americans as mentally diminished, emotionally immature, subservient, to mock African Americans for white entertainment.
Kelly ended up having to issue an apology the same day online after she was savaged on social media. And she apologized the next day on her show.
You may have heard that yesterday we had a discussion here about political correctness and Halloween costumes. And that conversation turned to whether it is ever okay for a person of one race to dress up as another. A black person making their face lighter or a white person making theirs darker to make a costume complete. I defended the idea, saying as long as it was respectful and part of a Halloween costume, it seemed okay. Well, I was wrong, and I am sorry.
Personally, she could have saved it because this is not the first time she's had to apologize for this sort of thing. There was this thing about Santa and Jesus a couple of years back.
Jesus was a white man, too. But, you know, it's like he was a historical figure. I mean, that's a verifiable fact, as is Santa.
Now, I could spend years compiling all of the racist media mess-ups committed by this country, and there will be those that still refuse to get it. It's especially prevalent in this year's election cycle. Political action committees, especially those supporting Republican candidates, have been engaged in this type of campaigning since forever.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Radio, TV, online, and even robocalls, all employing racism as a means of motivating the GOP base. In this election cycle, there are more women and people of color running for elective office, and the GOP is scared shitless. If they weren't, then why would they try so hard to suppress the black vote?
Early voting has begun in Georgia, which is electing a new governor. The Democratic candidate charges the Republican is working to suppress minority voting. The Republicans say they're trying to stop voter fraud.
The votes are being purged.
The talk of the Georgia governor's race right now isn't the economy or jobs. It's the right to vote. Democrat Stacey Abrams, who is vying to become the nation's first female African-American governor, accuses her GOP opponent, Brian Kemp, of trying to restrict black voting.
You think this is voter suppression? It is absolutely voter suppression.
Oh, that's a smokescreen trying to hide her radical views.
Kemp currently serves as Secretary of State, which means he runs Georgia's election system. Democrats say he has dropped more than 1 million voters from the roll since 2012, shuttered polling places in African-American communities, and championed the state's new exact match law, which put the registrations of 53,000 voters, most of them minorities, on hold.
Now, this is going to be one of the most closely watched races of the election, with Stacey Abrams possibly becoming the first black governor of the state of Georgia. In Florida, Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum is on track to become Florida's first black governor as well. However, he's been faced with some of the most racist campaign messaging ever heard. In fact, here's a robocall that went out on behalf of Gillum's challenger.
Well, hello there. I is the Negro Andrew Gillum, and I'll be asking you to make me governor of this here state of Florida.
Like I said, this type of messaging is typical for the Republican Party and those that support them. Most decent people are turned off by this sort of thing and in turn end up being turned off from voting.
I mean, it's really sickening.
The facts that they say are not true facts.
There's too much mudslinging.
A lot of backbiting going on, and we just want to know the facts. That's all we want.
This is an election that's between disgust and dislike.
We are adults, we are responsible individuals, and they shouldn't put out garbage out there.
Add the fact that you've got an openly declared racist as president.
He was accused, as you know, throughout the 70s of discriminating against minorities at his rental properties. In fact, he settled a case about that. That was in 1973, 1978, and 1992. He perpetuated birtherism, as you know, saying that President Obama wasn't born here, called Mexicans entering the country rapists and criminals. He refused to renounce David Duke, as you may recall. He said the Central Park Five were all still guilty, despite DNA evidence to the contrary. He said a judge could not be impartial because he was Mexican, had Mexican heritage, I should say. He said there were fine people on both sides of these Charlottesville protests that involved white supremacists. He attacks NFL players for kneeling during the anthem. He referred to Haiti and African countries as blank hole countries.
And other racists have the implied freedom to be blatant and open with their racism.
You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay?
Pretty much with no fear of any consequences.
A young woman gunned down by an illegal immigrant who should have been deported, but was protected by a sanctuary city.
In Hillary Clinton's America, the system stays rigged against Americans. Syrian refugees flood in. Illegal immigrants convicted of committing crimes get to stay.
In an insane effort to reduce gang violence, Janice Hahn hired hardcore gang members with taxpayer money to be gang intervention specialists. She even helped them get out of jail so they could rape and kill again.
Give me your cash, bitch, so we can shoot up the street. Give me your cash, bitch, so we can buy some more heat. Give me your cash, ho, so we can get out the pen. Give me your cash, ho, cause we back in again. Give me your cash.
Now, you may ask why it is that radio and TV stations continue to run these disgusting ads. Couple of reasons. One, the revenue generated by political advertising, And 2, in quite a few cases, they don't have a choice. Let me explain. Political advertising is governed by a very strict set of FCC rules. Section 315 of the Communications Act says that radio and TV stations are not allowed to censor a candidate's ad based on content, except in those rare cases where the ad violates a federal statute, like obscenity laws. And because of this, if the ad outright lies about the opposition or says something that causes harm to one's business interest, the station airing it is shielded from any liability, such as defamation of character. Now, in order to keep tight controls on political advertising, the rules also state that the ad has to be from the candidate's official campaign or an authorized political action committee. Media outlets do have an out, but most refuse to take it. Keep this in mind because I'll be getting back to it in a bit. Now, during this rather nasty election cycle, you've seen an abundance of so-called black conservatives making the cable TV rounds, cooning and buck dancing for their massa Donald Trump. Paris Denard.
When you are talking about something as so divisive as the racial issues that we have in this country, the president wanted to take the time to make sure you had all of the facts because every single word mattered.
Candace Owens.
He's doing a great job. The numbers are better, and he needs more time in office to continue to do an amazing job. So it sounds like you're almost aboard the Trump train, which makes me feel happy.
Diamond and Silk and Kanye West, to name a few.
We commend Kanye West for speaking up and speaking out about supporting our president. He can think for himself. He don't need anyone spoon-feeding him a narrative.
All proclaiming how good Massa Donald been to us poor old black folk.
Well, and if the ladies on the left, if they can wear their woodsy hats, then certainly we can wear our Make America Great Again hat.
Yeah.
To be clear, there are some black conservatives that I am willing to engage because they know the difference between being a conservative Republican and a Trump Republican. So I don't paint everyone with a broad brush. Now, I won't agree with 99.999% of what they have to say, but at least I am willing to listen. It's bad enough that the GOP continues to show that it has no regard for blacks in the party, and Trump's foot warmers, slavery reference, look it up, continue their insanity-laden farce to make Trump acceptable to black voters. And no, Trump isn't responsible for the lowest black unemployment rate in history, so we can shut that line down now. Bottom line, a racist with or without a sheet is still a racist. Speaking of blacks cooning for Republicans, a group called Black Americans for the President's Agenda released what I see as the most disgusting, stereotypically political ad I've heard in my 30-plus years as a media personality and voiceover artist.
What do you think about what's happening in Washington?
Our Congressman French Hill and the Republicans know that it's dangerous to change the presumption of innocence to a presumption of guilt, especially for black men. If the Democrats can do that to a white justice of the Supreme Court with no evidence, no corroboration, and all of her witnesses, including her best friend, say it didn't happen, what will happen to our husbands, our fathers, or our sons when a white girl lies on them?
Girl, white Democrats will be lynching black folk again.
Honey, I've always told my son, don't be messing around with that. If you get caught, she will cry rape.
I'm voting to keep Congressman French Hill and the Republicans because we have to protect our men and boys. We can't afford to let white Democrats take us back to bad old days of race verdicts, life sentences, and lynchings when a white girl screams rape.
Paid for by Black Americans for the President's Agenda. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
This commercial is running in a lot of the HDBAs of Congressman Hill's district in Arkansas. HDBA is a marketing term that stands for High Density Black Area. While Hill has denounced the ad, he's still benefiting from it, and as of this broadcast, the ad is still running. There's also another version of the same ad running for another candidate. The fact that the commercial is full of bull is one thing. The most disgusting thing for me as a black media professional is that the PAC is headed up by a black man, a sellout Negro. That's spelled K-N-E-E-G-R-O. Definition: one who willingly supplants himself in order to curry favor with his oppressor. This Negro's name is Vernon Robinson. Robinson is a one-time city councilman, failed congressional candidate whose stock and trade is selling out black folks.
If you're a conservative Republican, watching the news these days can make you feel as though you are in the Twilight Zone. Americans are under attack from Islamic extremists in every corner of the world. Homosexuals are mocking holy matrimony, and the lesbians and feminists are attacking everything sacred. Liberal judges have completely rewritten the Constitution. You can burn the American flag and kill 1 million babies a year, but you can't post the 10 Commandments or say God in public.
One nation under...
7 out of every 10 black children are born out of wedlock, and Jackson and Sharpton claim the answer is racial quotas. And the aliens are here, but they didn't come in a spaceship. They came across our unguarded Mexican border by the millions.
I'm Vernon Robinson. If you send me to Congress, I'll send that back to the Twilight Zone. I approve of this message and of traditional American values.
Now, this idiot maintains that Republicans are leading the way when it comes to criminal justice reform, when in fact, one of the senators from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, has been one of the leading voices against reform. What's even more disgusting is that he actually found 2 black women who willingly whored themselves out to voice this piece of trash in order to advance its racist agenda. This amounts to black folks putting on blackface. During my time in radio as a program director, I've always felt a responsibility not only to our listeners and advertisers, but to our images as black people.
Hold it now! V103.9.
This is Mark Gunn, music director of the new V103.9. Recently, we've announced a policy that states that this radio station will no longer play any music that denigrates the black community.
This black-owned and operated radio station in Los Angeles was the first in the country to edit its playlist. It reflects a growing sentiment in the African-American community, a love-hate relationship with rap. They love the music. They hate the violent images and raunchy language of hardcore rap.
To that end, there were certain kinds of advertisements I would not allow on air. Malt liquor ads and commercials that tended to be stereotypical. There was a local advertising agency that I took to task one time because of the stereotypical nature of one of their commercials. I demanded that changes be made before the spots would be aired and had final approval. At the end of the day, the agency got the message. They wanted the advantage of being on the #1 radio station in the market, but I wouldn't allow them to offend my people in order to do it. Now, I mentioned earlier that for radio and TV stations, there is a way to get around playing these offensive political ads. Many simply choose not to. I'll explain after this. If you're an advertiser, one of the most important things about getting your message out is actually standing out from the rest of the crowd. If you're listening to this program right now, this is where you'd hear your commercial. As an exclusive sponsor of Gunshots Straight from the Hip, your commercial is professionally produced and gets a longer shelf life based on your needs. Gunshots Straight from the Hip is a unique and compelling program unlike anything else in the marketplace. Episodes are available for download on iTunes, TuneIn, and MarkGunMedia.com. And depending on how you tailor your message, the potential for new and repeat customers is that much greater. Best of all, it's extremely cost-effective. If you'd like more information on how you can be a sponsor of this broadcast, call Mark Gunn Media, Inc. at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Or log on to markgunmedia.com. For downloads of this and past episodes and information about all the multimedia services we offer, log on to our website at www.markgunmedia.com. That's markgunmedia.com. Welcome back to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. This episode, Black Faces in Blackface, Megyn Kelly and Black Sellouts. We've been talking about the recent rash of political ad campaigns that tend to be a little racist in nature, and the media's responsibility to its consumers when it comes to those ads. For more context, here's a quick history of racism in political advertising.
Racist tactics go as far back as 1868. Take this ad by the Democratic Party that labeled Republicans as a party for the Negro and vilified them for supporting equal rights for black people. Around the same time in California, Chinese immigrants were being portrayed as the enemy of the white working class. This was one of many ads by the Workingmen's Party of California in 1877. Similarly, in 1919, U.S. Senator James Fallon ran his campaign with the slogan, "Keep California White." These campaign ads exacerbated the anti-Asian sentiments of California at the time, hammering in the narrative that immigrants were taking away jobs. The 1960s saw a very important shift in the way racism was used in political campaign ads.
It marks the moment when racism goes underground in American politics. During the civil rights movement, it became more and more dangerous for politicians to clearly, expressly identify the racial appeals in their messages.
It was Richard Nixon who perfected the art of dog whistling in his 1968 campaign. But the idea that one could conjure up the irrational racist fears of a certain group without ever referring to race itself was introduced by a Southern Democrat named George Wallace.
George Wallace was subject to widespread ridicule as an unrepentant Southern racist. And Wallace very quickly learned that lesson, and he moved away from open endorsements of white supremacy and began to talk about law and order and states' rights. So Nixon tacked to the right and began to use dog whistle themes in order to pull some of the Wallace voters.
By law and order, he was conjuring up the image of African Americans and civil rights protesters as criminals and lawbreakers. And by states' rights, he meant the right to resist integration. Nixon made this coded language the core of his campaign.
Take the offensive. Freedom from fear is a basic right of every American. We must restore it.
It's not really about law and order as an abstraction. It's really about scaring white voters about the threat posed, supposedly, by African Americans and Latinos.
Nixon's legacy of using racially coded messaging was built upon by both Republicans, like Reagan's infamous welfare queen, and Democrats, like Bill Clinton.
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've called for an end to welfare as we know it, so welfare can be a second chance, not a way of life. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty.
He runs an ad that says he's a new sort of Democrat who promises to end welfare as a way of life. Well, ostensibly, welfare was a way of life for who exactly? And then he says that as a new Democrat, he's going to crack down on crime. Well, who supposedly are the criminals?
And even after the U.S. elected its first black president, an analysis of John McCain's 2008 campaign showed that several of his campaign ads darkened Barack Obama's skin color to make him look more threatening and to appeal to the racial biases of his voters. A lot of the racism towards Obama also manifested itself in carefully planted user videos and the 24/7 dog whistling of conservative media outlets. Like this video that went viral in 2012.
Yes, everybody in Cleveland, low minority got Obama phone.
It played on the idea that people of color were voting for Democrats because of handouts.
Donald Trump's America is secure. Terrorists and dangerous criminals kept out. The border secure. Our families safe.
Donald Trump's 2016 campaign was almost a return to the older pre-Nixon era. He ran a highly racialized, highly aggressive campaign because unlike previous Republicans, he didn't care if Democrats or liberal journalists recognized his racism. The only thing he cared about was if his voting base saw him as racist.
Trump, like they, are allegedly victims of a political correctness on the left that cares more about the feelings of minorities than it does, in their minds, about taking care of white citizens.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
These are moves that allow people who describe essentially racial threats from brown-skinned others, but who can turn around and say, race? I wasn't saying race, I just said illegals are rapists.
The 2018 primaries are no different.
Build the wall. Swamp Captain Mitch McConnell has created millions of jobs for China people.
Amar Kapanajar is working to infiltrate Congress. He's used 3 different names to hide his family's ties to terrorism.
Delgado laced his lyrics with extremist attacks on American values.
God bless our rap.
I got a big truck, just in case I need to round up criminal illegals and take them home myself.
This is a story of the rich manipulating racism as a divide and distract tactic, and all of us as its targets and victims. And that's what we've seen in this country from Republicans and from Democrats.
I also mentioned the obligation that media outlets have when it comes to running political ads and how stations are not allowed by law to censor an ad's content, except under certain circumstances. Now, these ads can be as offensive and inflammatory as the candidates want, as long as there's no violation of federal obscenity laws and the ads come straight from the candidate or from an authorized political action committee. I also talked about a loophole available to media outlets, but because of financial considerations, it isn't used very often. You see, advertising submitted by third-party PACs or groups with no official affiliation to the campaign or the candidate are not subject to Section 315 of the FCC code. Because of this, media outlets can censor or outright reject these ads, such as the one from African Americans for the president's agenda. The thing is, they don't do that because of the revenue these ads bring, and that's a shame. Dollars over decency. And in this case of this particular ad being aired on mostly black stations, it becomes even more problematic. Radio stations are granted licenses to serve the public trust. Commercials like this don't do that. And because outside political action committees aren't subject to the rules governing legitimate campaigns, these stations can be held liable for any defamatory or slanderous language being used. Not only are they selling out their audiences, they're also putting themselves at risk. Bad enough that there really aren't a whole lot of black-owned radio stations to deal with. And it's been my personal experience that unless ownership really listens to the people of color they employ in these non-black-owned stations, 9 times out of 10, they're going to do something stupid. Their music playlist would be a good place to start. I mean, really. Sorry, that's the program director in me talking. What would really be hurtful is if that rare black-owned entity chose to be party of this self-degradation. They'd lose the trust of their core audience and eventually whatever advertising base they had. After all, why spend money on a station with no ratings, right? That would be tragic because for a great deal of black people, black radio is their primary source of information. And with the desecration of many black newsrooms, that role becomes increasingly important. Imagine selling out to an evil you're desperately seeking approval from, only to never get it. So while these tiresome attack ads continue to air all the way through November 6th, I urge you to cut through the clutter. Turn off the media if you have to, and no matter what, get to the polls on November 6th. Given the landscape of this election, not only is it a referendum on Trump and the GOP, it's also a chance to decide what kind of America this country wants to be. You've been talking a lot about being against the Republican Party and its racism, but will you prove it? We'll know for sure on November 7th, won't we? You've been listening to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. The views expressed are those of the host and guests and not reflective of any business entity or anyone associated with this broadcast. If you have any comments or want more information on how to be a sponsor, log on to our website at markgunmedia.com or call us at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Thank you for listening.
Mark Gun Media. No hype, no hoopla, just damn good work.